Hello, everyone. I'm Dale McGee from the New England History of Medicine Society, and I'm thrilled today to have Caitlin Angelone give us a presentation on what I consider to be a very important topic, institutional care and societal changes, the Elwyn experience. Caitlin Angelone is the archivist at Elwyn. She graduated with a Master's of Library and Information Science from Drexel University and has been a guest speaker on the history of Elwyn, medical ethics in historic research, and archival processing, and has access to sensitive collections at the American Library Association, the Westchester University, and the College of Physicians in Philadelphia. She co-curated the exhibit Imperfecta for the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which explored the scientific and social history of teratology from antiquity to present. So I'm thrilled to have Caitlin Angelone with us today. Look forward to what she has to say. Take it away, Caitlin.
All right. So hello, and thank you for coming to listen to me today. And thank you to Dale for inviting me. I am Caitlin Angelone, as Dale just said. I'm the archivist for Elwyn, and today I will be discussing the changes in institutional care and society, specifically through Elwyn's collection and history, since that is what I manage. And also, since I would not say I am a historian, I am an archivist. I'm a trained librarian, but working with our collection, I have gotten a very in-depth understanding of our history. I will be leaving time for questions at the end, but you also can feel free to put anything in the chat if that's enabled, and I'll answer those at the end as well. So I do not want to assume you all know what Elwyn is, so I will touch briefly on what we do today. Elwyn was founded in 1852, making us the oldest surviving organization that works with individuals with intellectual and developmental disability, or IDD. Elwyn is a multi-state nonprofit organization that provides education, treatment, and support services for children and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, autism, and related behavioral health needs. Our headquarters is in Media, Pennsylvania, with locations throughout the United States. And for more information, you can check out elwyn.org. I would also like to state that this presentation does use language that is outdated and demoralizing to a modern audience when speaking about the disability community. As I am sure many of you are aware, language changes and has evolved over time. Elwyn does not condone the use of this language outside of historical discussions. I will not spend too much time on the broader history of disability, as I am going to assume this audience does have a small understanding. I'm not necessarily qualified to be doing all that, and I would like to focus more on Elwyn's impact. But it is still important to lay a foundation, so we're going to begin around 1852. When we look at the state of care in 1852, there was a large lack of scientific understanding of disability. This also means that there was a lack of support for children and their families. When they grew to adulthood, it could be hard to gain employment or earn a living if you had complex needs. By the mid-19th century, educators, physicians, and advocates began exploring better care options, but a large focus was still on mental health, deaf and hard of hearing persons, persons who are blind, and speech disabilities. There was a large lack of services to support IDD, or what they would call feeble-mindedness at the time, and only 2 schools in the nation existed, one in Massachusetts and one in New York. Increased urbanization was also starting throughout much of America. How it affected the experts, or scientists and physicians, they had the ability to share scientific information quickly within the profession organizations, which led to increased studies, writings, and discussion on social issues that included things like the care for the disabled and poor. Increased immigration also caused fear and discontent, causing individuals to look for blame. Scientists and social reformers began to explore ways to, quote, fix the so-called ills of society, such as crime, vice, and a lack of Christian values. These theories and support shifted over time, with disability many times being in the conversation. How it affected the family. Before large, dense urban populations in America, individuals may have lived on generational farms, homesteads, or smaller villages and colonies. Working meant just surviving and supporting your community, such as growing food, hunting, mending clothes, and caring for the household. Individuals with disability could be cared for by family and community members. Those with lower needs could help their household through modified work and be more integrated into the community. Urbanization caused more people to leave these communities for nuclear family values, such as working to buy a home and the rise of the middle class. More crime, diverse populations, and congested areas also could lead to mistrust of one another outside of the core nuclear home. There was a growing fear among families about the care surrounding their disabled children, as they realized it would be hard for their children to survive without them, and how it affected the individual. Removing people out of smaller communities meant less people to care for those with more complex or higher needs. Quicker, high-paced work would make it difficult to keep up in industrial settings, and this lack of ability to work could place individuals in almshouses. There was also a pressure to remain socially acceptable, and things such as ugly laws were being established, which is focused on diseased, maimed, mutilated, or deformed individuals. The very presence of being ill or disabled could land you in prison if out in the public. So let's move on to Elwyn now. Elwyn can trace its roots to James B. Richards, who is pictured here, an educator trained by Samuel Gridley Howe. If you're unfamiliar with Samuel Gridley Howe, he was an American physician, educator, abolitionist, and social reformer. Richards taught at Howe's Massachusetts School for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Youth. In Howe's writings, you can see his respect for Richards and his hopes that his pupil would one day begin a school of his own. Richard eventually comes to Philadelphia in 1852 and settled in the Germantown section. He opens a small schoolhouse called the James B. Richards School for the teaching and training of backward and imbecile children. Like Howe's models, students were to be taught by competent teachers using patience and sympathetic guidance. He was also open to the idea of housing students on campus, as there was the belief that taking students away from the influence of home would gain better results. He quickly began to run into financial trouble and networked to gain larger support for his endeavors. Richards calls on a group of physicians, policymakers, and philanthropists in July of 1852. He recommends a state school, explaining his methods and results of his efforts in Massachusetts. It is pointed out that no effort has been made in Pennsylvania to provide education to the feeble-minded, and he starts to gain support. The men begin to plan to solicit subscriptions, draft an incorporation, and present to the legislature at Harrisburg. They are successful, and the Pennsylvania Training School for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Children is chartered. It's also the third school in the country for such things. Also of note, although we did receive federal funding and were chartered, PTS was considered a private school. Children were admitted at the discretion of a committee. This was also used later to take students of lower needs that needed less care. We can see early on there's a distinction of who is valued and who is not valued in society. All men in the founding of the school were abolitionists and interested in philanthropy for the community. The school was integrated by race and gender early on. Although primarily serving the tri-state area of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, lack of schools such as the training school led to students being admitted from all over the country and sometimes even islands like Cuba or Puerto Rico. Our first Constitution states that the sole purpose was for the mental, moral, and physical education of children. It also implies students should eventually leave to graduate, with the state only providing finances to a student for 5 years. It is assumed they should be trained and able to hold a job, thus no longer needing the institution. The first annual report published in 1854 focuses on what many other educators and physicians felt at the time: sympathy and pity, not always empathy. There is a strong focus on the idea of usefulness instead of the human right to simply exist. This parallels with the industrial capitalistic nature of society at the time. To be a good citizen was to be one of use and to be independent. The board makes Richards the first principal, and they continue to use Richards Schoolhouse. Pupils begin in September of 1853, and there was at least 10. That same year, the first female instructor is hired, Miss Sarah D. Holmes. Eventually, they purchased new grounds in Germantown owned by the school itself. James B. Richards was an advocate for what we would now consider early intervention. This is an image that appears in our first annual report. Richards states, when the student first comes to the school, he could not feed himself, speak, or hold himself up. He only drank milk, unable to properly chew. His mother was distressed as she feared for what would happen to her child as she grew older. The milk consumption was also a burden on the household financially. After 3 years within the school, the student was able to sit at the table, chew properly, and express his needs and desires. He was back at home, and although he was not, quote, cured, he was able to care for himself and contribute to the household, and Richards was pleased with this. An important portion of Richards' teaching methods were of individualized care and schedules. Schedules were seen as an essential to training, allowing predictability and practice for a student. We of course know now this can be a great tool for individuals with neurodiversity or IDD. Students abided by a schedule, getting up every day at 6 a.m. with matrons who would assist them in getting ready. Gradually, the matron would remove herself to instill confidence. After breakfast, students worked on academics, behavioral and social skills, and learning job skills depending on their current needs. Students joined together again for dinner and free time. Lights were off by 9 p.m. Richard saw the value in a full night's rest and hoped students would get as much as 9 hours if possible. Furthering individual care, sometimes new methods were approached, such as the implementation of objects. Richard speaks of instances where to help a child speak, a chain was used to assist the child in pronouncing the letter B. The tactile feeling of something between the girl's lips helped her speak. There was also the object room, which is pictured here. The object room is as it sounds, a room of objects. Students were able to learn using toys and engaging with the world on a smaller scale. They would learn the objects in detail, using their 5 senses, and eventually would be exposed to larger models on campus through vocational work. Now we would accept this as part of childhood. It is fun to play with a toy kitchen, but using the toy kitchen also helps teach a student learn the name and uses of food, utensils, and social skills like sharing and caring for themselves as they reach milestones to be more independent. Edouard Seguin, French physician and educator, also joined the team at PTS. But his time was short-lived, and so was Richards, who both left around 1856 as tensions with the board began. The board was dissatisfied with their time in Germantown and wished to move and expand. New superintendent Joseph Parrish made a plea to Dorothea Dix, who was assisting in opening institutions in the New England area with a focus on mental health asylums. She was impressed by the work and put together a presentation to request more money from Pennsylvania for the school. Being a woman, she was unable to step into the capital herself, so Alfred Elwyn and Alonzo Potter did on her behalf. Their pleas were successful, and they were awarded $10,000 to buy a new land and erect a building. Dix helped search for a new area. She recommended an area 20 miles from Philadelphia in Media, Pennsylvania. Known at the time for its farmland and commerce trading, it was also along the Westchester-Philadelphia Railroad, which was very appealing. It would be easy for visitors and physicians coming from Philadelphia. It also meant families could visit their loved ones easier. Although regular visits were not encouraged, visitation hours were allowed. The acres of farmland would supply reliable food, but also allow vocational work in farming and manufacturing for students. We still own the land that was purchased in 1857, and our headquarters sits on it. The main building, or what was known as the administrative building for many years, was the first building built on our campus. And this is 2 different photos of it, or one's an etching, one's a photo. It was designed to allow bright lighting, airflow, and wings for matrons to easily oversee the children during the day and at night. The superintendent, teachers, matrons, and all the students resided in this building until other buildings began to go around campus. PTS began to stand out for many reasons, but one was the close relationship it had with surrounding community, one that still does continue to this day. With the land and media being close to businesses and the railroad, the public's welcome to the institution for various events held throughout the year. Thursdays were advertised as open to the public. Students would perform their exercises outside, and the board hoped this would encourage donations if the public saw the progress being made. Offering Day began in 1860. This was a day to celebrate the children and provide offerings. The first year raised $1,700, which would now be converted to about $65,000. Funds from Offering Day were put towards the buildings and other uses, but also for the Children's Amusement Fund to buy toys and supply entertainment on the grounds. Our annual report donation lists are expansive, with individuals traveling to donate furniture, toys, food from their farms, and even flowers to brighten up classrooms. When looking through our annual reports and other administrative records, it is obvious that the school relied heavily on the support of the community and neighbors to keep it afloat in its earlier years, and the neighbors were happy to help. PTS began a ladies' visiting group, which consisted mostly of upper-class women associated with the institution, and they were tasked with advising on the proper care of children, keeping the grounds attractive, and organizing public events like Offering Day. These outreach events matched the societal philanthropy of the time. As the middle class was rising, charitable giving was also rising. The Civil War brought changes for PTS as it did for much of America. PTS experienced a loss of federal funding and loss of tuition from Southern students due to the lack of reliable postal service. Students from the South were eventually sent back to their home states in solidarity with the Union, as some of our administrators and students were serving the war. Joseph Parrish fought in the war on the Sanitary Commission and eventually resigns to continue work with war veterans. His resignation led to Isaac Curlin stepping into the role of superintendent, and we will get to him in a moment. When the North experienced large industrial growth after the war, it also saw accelerated urbanization. This began to affect PTS in multiple ways. The industrial growth helped cities, but did not always help philanthropic endeavors. Inflation, strain on production, and more competitive job markets affected Philadelphia and those able to give. PTS had to become creative with how they would support themselves, and this led to an increased emphasis on manual labor done by students themselves to support their closed community. Urbanization also increased poverty levels and assistance needed for struggling families. There were pressure to increase the number of students admitted to PTS simply because children needed a place to live and food to eat. While before PTS could be more selective with the students they took in, the reliance on students' manual labor and relationships with surrounding almshouses and aid societies caused the campus to grow to keep up with changing dynamics. Although never overcrowded to the point of inhumane conditions, it caused strain on the ideas of education and resources. Isaac Curlin is appointed in 1864 and ushers in a new era for PTS. Curlin was an American physician and administrator. Graduating from the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine in 1856, he stepped into the role of assistant in 1858 and become superintendent in 1864. He respected the education model set forth by Dr. Howe, and after their deaths, it can be argued he was one of the leading experts on disability at the time. He assisted in finding the Association of Medical Officers of American Institutions for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Persons, and surrounded institutions looked to PTS and Curlin for advice on many things, such as treatment, care, grounds and administrative management, and intake. However, as a man of science, you can see his later writings shift to one of the support of eugenics, which, if you're unaware, is coined in 1883 by Francis Galton, who argued that society could be improved by encouraging reproduction among those deemed fit and discouraging among those considered unfit. and Curlin supported institutionalization, the permanent segregation of these individuals. Eugenics and segregation were a response to the changing dynamics around race, class, and gender. With so much respect given to Curlin, it can be said his shift in following the scientific trends also helped shift care models to one of lifelong institutionalization for IDD community, which was not the original intention for the school. We will now look a little bit closer at this point in time. Increased population caused the expansion of the campus outside of the main buildings. Buildings with a purpose were erected under Curlin, such as a dedicated schoolhouse, a hospital and quarantine areas, stables, and a mattress broom workshop. By the end of his tenure, the campus had grown 200 acres and saw the addition of 10 student housing buildings. Tunnels were put through campus to help with steam, heating, and use as passageways on days of bad weather. PTS was one of the first areas in Delaware County to have working electricity and phones. Curlin saw phones as a good way to connect to others on campus in case of an emergency, and electricity to add to the comfort of residents and decrease fire risks. This era also saw the addition of the custodial homes. These buildings were located further on the outskirts of campus with a small trolley connecting them to the rest of campus. PTS was struggling with the realization that not all students they took in could be taught to live independently. The custodial homes were to house long-term residents who may grow into adulthood and not be able to be released to the public, whether it was because of the inability to live independently or the rising institutional mindset of certain classes. Later, these homes would also serve another purpose, for asylum cases, which were individuals that administrators claimed to have behaviors that made them at risk to other students or themselves. Sometimes they were also seen as homes for punishment. The use of these homes made it clear that even within the IDD community, administrators saw a hierarchy of who was to be treated well and who would have the potential to leave. Curlin also published the Manual of Elwyn before his death. This manual, which is also digitized through archive.org if you ever want to check it out, goes into extensive details about the rules and regulations on Elwyn's campus. And I always liken it to a modern HR handbook. It is broken into 3 parts: general rules and house orders, duties defined and instructions given, and the sundry bulletins. For the sundry bulletins, we have the original bulletins via scrapbook compiled by Curlin, and that is one of those photographs in the middle here. The book was published in hopes it could influence other institutions which were beginning to pop up over America. It is clear from Curlin's accounts he demands respect for the individuals he was institutionalizing, which shows the complexity in society's relationship with IDD. For rules, it stated that workers are expected to perform with cheerfulness and the best of their ability all duties that may be assigned. They are to respect privacy by avoiding, quote, repeating conduct, conversation, or names of patients, except in a pleasing manner. And, quote, slander and gossip should not be indulged in. He is also aware of the public perception that former inmates can give, writing, quote, it is very desirable that our more intelligent children should leave the institution with pleasant recollections of it. It is undeniable that in most cases, they are quite competent to give a correct account of the treatment they receive from those about them. And this obviously shows he was concerned over a bad reputation. He has specific orders in case of a fire, with a modern tone under on the discovery of a fire: make no clamor, do not create a panic, keep cool. The care for children is specific, stating special regard should be taken in the instruction of children in proper modes of dressing and caring for themselves. And our rule of government is one of kindness, and that no severities or meanness towards the children should be tolerated. While punishments were given at Elwyn, guidelines were given, with Curlin writing, while it may be admissible to shorten meals as a means of correction, this must not be done on the injury of the child, and not in any case must the breakfast be interfered with. Let the day start on a square, hot meal. Details are also provided on inspections of rooms, care of dining tables, schoolrooms, cleaning schedules, and temperaments of employees. The sundry bulletins come from the bulletin board Curlin had on campus, in which Curlin would post announcements for staff. All staff were expected to read these announcements, with some alluding to certain events that upset him. An example here in the middle is one published in both the manual and in the bulletin regarding his sensitivity to children crying. It states that children should not be neglected when crying, but should be properly cared for. The same year the manual was published in 1892, he also addresses the Association of Medical Officers in support of, quote, surgery for the relief of idiotic conditions. And he asks, whose state shall be the first to legitimize hysterectomy and testicular removal for the relief and cure of radical depravity? The manual shows a complex nature to the institution and one of Curlin himself. While a eugenicist that advocated for institutionalization and sterilizations, he also showed a tender heart to the ones within his care, and one he felt others outside of the walls of PTS should have as well. Through medical reports, school progress reports, physical exams, and the idiocy and etiology blank forms, which are some of the things in this photograph here, PTS also sets a standard for record keeping within the institution. Aside from recording the mechanics of the institution, he begins to record the students themselves. I will look a little closer at the idiocy and etiology forms now. You may see these in various ways in institutions across America, and my understanding is this is due to Curlin's influence. We have various letters in our collection asking for examples and information regarding the intake process. Blanks were considered mandatory for anyone hoping to gain admission to the institution. The forms would be filled out by physicians, administrators at social service organizations, or a parent and guardian. The blanks came in two forms to be filled. The first portion was the personal descriptive blank. It consists of 102 questions regarding the individual's features, abilities, education, behavior, and medical history. The form could be used to help create what we would now call an individualized education program, or IEP, for a student. Understanding the information a student already knows, what their strengths are, and what they still need help in. They could also be used to help filter out students. Questions on vaccinations could help expose a possible medical liability, while questions on behaviors such as liking fire or running away could help the institution make decisions on if they could handle the child's possible oversight. The last few questions are of interest as they give a glimpse into the societal dynamics of the time. One question asks the cause of the child's condition, where you can begin to see the theories of what is causing disabilities such as genetics, illness, or a bad injury. Another question asks, what do you expect from a course of training? Here you are provided conversation around the hopes and dreams of parents. While some parents were eager to send their child away, the reality was many were not. Responses such as to become useful, to be cured, to be able to care for oneself after their death, or in one reply, a mother has now taken to work at a factory because her husband left and she can no longer care for her son. She hopes he can learn to be self-supportive. Her answer begins with, "Oh, I don't know." That lends itself to the understanding the exacerbation she was feeling and how many other parents felt the same. These answers show glimpses of the very tough reality that parents face with industry rising in America. For some, it was no longer an option to hope for the best. They were seeking social services. The second portion of the blanks were the etiological history. This portion tried to understand the individual through scientific research and eugenic theories. They detailed parents' information, the physical birth of the child, vice consumption, or information on siblings and extended family, such as questioning of signs of insanity, tuberculosis, or other diseases. All these things could be seen as indicators for the cause of a disabled child or poor hereditary makeup. A focus was also put on the mother in many cases, asking for the condition of the mother during gestation. Here you also see the societal shifts from maternal impressions to better scientific understanding. While hereditary disease is mentioned, so are cases of being scared by snakes, an unsightly beggar, or being worried her husband would be drafted to the Civil War. Responses show why things like ugly laws were being put into place, as it was fully believed they could imprint the child within the womb via the mother's reactions to her surroundings. Martin Barr serves as superintendent from 1893 to 1930. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School as well. He was also supportive of eugenics and institutionalization. He wrote extensively on disability and is credited with writing one of the first textbooks on IDD, Mental Defectives, Their History, Treatment, and Training, published in 1913, was used by physicians in the field who were hoping to get a better understanding of this new scientific research. His desire to classify individuals helped the nomenclature of idiot, moron, and imbecile remain in scientific understanding. He provides hierarchical levels. The highest level are the backward, who have the ability to mental process normally, but possibly slow and requiring special training. The opposite end of the spectrum would be an excitable or apathetic imbecile, individuals that would require asylum care and were considered unimprovable. His text outlines them all with photographs and examples. Their value is again placed alongside what they can produce for society, and there is a fear that if individuals intermingle with feeble-mindedness, they can also become corrupt. He supports individuals within the institution also being segregated in their respective classes. He states training is one of doing, so vocational training becomes a large focus. But this also begins to look like child labor, as students help keep the costs of the institution down by making and selling items for one another and the public. Despite his unsettling uses of terms and overall attitudes to the individuals he was overseeing, humanity again does peek through. While individuals placed in asylum may be unimprovable to Barr, he again advocates for more humane treatment by giving them nourishing food, frequent baths, and tender mothering. As he details the education training for students, he supports one of patience and care. He also lists the bibliography of Seguin, who we touched on earlier. An interesting blend of honoring the founders and the study of the field while also conforming to the new scientific approaches that favored eugenics. His correspondence collection we hold also shows the complexity of administrators like Barr. Our Barr correspondence collection is unique in that it does not just contain the letter books of Barr, it also contains to and from parents, colleagues, and aid societies. They display the various pressure and demands put on Barr and when he is willing to concede to his personal beliefs. While other institutions looking at PTS for guidance on how to care for their disabled, under Barr students were allowed freedoms that others did not grant. Stage productions allowed creativity, which is one of the stage productions is photographed here, up in the left-hand side. Students could earn the ability to leave campus for the day, for trips to the city without a matron. A fan of theater, movies were shown weekly for the entertainment of students. The Elwyn band was highly skilled and well-funded. Students in the band went on trips to perform in parades and schools. Team sports competed with local public schools, intermingling institutionalized students and the public. But his petty nature also shows the lengths he would go to keep students on campus for good. He writes of punishment measures, such as sending students to the asylum wards or clothing them in weights if they were flight risks. In some cases, he writes to government officials, begging for them to intervene if a, quote, low-grade student, parents wish to take them home for good. As mentioned, we were a private institution, and parents could simply remove their child. But pressures were put on parents for students to remain, and many parents, being in compromised positions, would relent. While the government did not intervene often in his requests, you can see he wishes to pressure others to a more institutional and custodial approach. Speaking of the parents, the letters show the pressures put on the institution itself. Barr's willingness to bend to the will of parents is one reason I believe our doors may still be open. If parents suspected mistreatment or abuse, Barr was so concerned with the public image of the institution, as he was a prominent man of the community. In response, conversations were had to support the child, and parents constantly advocated for their children. While visiting hours tended to be 1 day a week, usually on a weekday, letters written show Barr handed out visitation rights on other days if parents could not make it out because of their busy schedules. Letters show requests to take their kids on summer vacations, with many being granted. The complexities of Barr's letters show the societal turmoil of the desire to institutionalize or fix society and the acknowledgement that these individuals were also humans who had done nothing other than simply be disabled. While dignity was not always given, pity was, and this could have been used for better treatment. Arthur Whitney becomes superintendent in 1930, and he serves until 1960. It can be said he comes in a time of stagnation. At this point, institutional care models are widely accepted as the best choice to serve individuals with IDD. We see the rise of more state schools and institutions. The state of Pennsylvania attempts to purchase Elwyn in the late 1920s. The board voted against it, using their own personal funds to continue to support Elwyn, wanting to remain private. But why is this so crucial? If you look at state-run institutions during this period, you will many times see one of abuse, mistreatment, and neglect. Many of you may be familiar with the infamous Pennhurst State School here in Pennsylvania that ended up being a crucial part of the civil rights movement for the disability community. We can acknowledge that Elwyn was an institution, keeping many individuals against their will, and abuse was still part of that institutional system. But also, to be run by the state could also be a worse fate. At Elwyn, during this era, students were still being given freedoms that many institutions serving IDD simply did not have. Students were free to join the military. 108 students enlisted in services during World War II. In 1946, the first Boy Scout troop in an IDD school began. Boy Scouts became a large part of Elwyn for many years, receiving various honors and badges. Students were trusted to camp in the surrounding woods, Chesapeake Bay, Valley Forge, and New Mexico. A Parent-Staff Association began in the 1940s. They made crucial recommendations to the board on how to improve the quality of life for their children. Through their efforts on fundraising, Elwyn saw the implementation of more entertainment options, such as a pool, playgrounds, bowling lanes, and a mini golf course. Although this may seem minimal, it again showed Elwyn's willingness to understand the concerns of parents and the basic rights individuals in the community deserved. By the late 19th century, scientific and social changes began to shift the perspective of how we treated individuals with IDD. Nationally, civil rights reforms were starting to take shape around race and gender. Individuals in the disability community began forming the self-advocacy movement, but there was still little government and institutional movement towards better treatment. In 1960, Gerald Clark stepped in as superintendent. A physician with a special interest in social sciences, he was attuned to the self-advocacy movement and began quickly making sweeping changes. A 12-page document written in February of 1961, only 4 months after his hiring, shows the drastic changes that went on campus well before acts such as the Pennsylvania Mental Health and Mental Retardation Act of 1966 that established continuum county system care, or the 1977 federal court ruling against Pennhurst State School that influenced fair wages in training schools. Clark started administratively first, establishing regular group meetings of departments to establish joint policies and decisions. Directors were appointed to handle large issues so staff could handle routine matters. Salaries were increased. Attendants were now called counselors, with more training given to reflect the title change. They began newsletters to inform staff and parents and residents on key changes and positive news to grow community. The school name was changed from Elwyn Training School to Elwyn School to avoid confusion with correctional institutions, which Clark clearly did not see Elwyn as one of them anymore. For residents and students, they too saw changes. The term children was disbanded, with a more neutral student being used. Physical punishment and censoring of male was discontinued. Bars were removed from windows and locks removed from resident halls. Visiting hours were extended to weekends, longer vacation periods were allowed, and payphones were installed to allow calls home. The canteen was extended for weekend hours, where students had access to gum, ice cream, and coffee, which they did not have access to before, giving something for them to do on weekends outside of their dorms and outside of school. Education also became a focus, and that was all within 4 months of his time being our director. As part of this document, Clark also begins to outline his changes for vocation training. Before this, as established, Elwyn's training ended up being more at the benefit of the institution. Clark began by appointing a director specifically for vocation and sought licensing by the State Department of Public Instruction and the Pennsylvania Department of Vocational Rehabilitation to introduce systematic and fair work opportunities. These would still be sheltered workshops, which meant they were still segregated from the public, but it did give opportunity for fair wages and support. An economics teacher was hired to help students budget their newfound income. A director of research, Marvin Kivitz, was appointed, and a few years later, he does eventually step in as president after Clark retires. Unlike scientific research of years past, his research was one of defending of vocational training, education, and community living. In 1964, the Community Living and Working Project was initiated that ran into 1968. Its goal was to train students to become independent of the institution by teaching students domestic skills, behavioral skills, trade skills, and to live independently in community housing. If this sounds familiar, it is. Elwyn went full circle with its original mission in 1852. Although we do not have much in terms of research documents from this period, we do have a video that details their guided approach that involved on-site assistance, social workers to help transition students to living on their own, and they also published what they called guides to the community. These were given to students and touched on money management, living alone, emergency services, and legal advice. 128 were discharged after the program. A follow-up on 65 students a few months later found that 95% of the students were still employed, avoiding legal trouble, and were living on their own. Many longitudinal studies on whether someone was better off in the community, home, or an institution did not begin until the 1980s. Elwyn was again reflecting the needed changes in society. The video states, quote, "If a rehabilitation philosophy is to succeed, it must start with top management. The staff must be trained to look beyond mere custody and actively embrace the goals of rehabilitation. They must banish myths and preconceived notions about ability levels and potential of handicapped students and workers." By the late 1980s, laws swept through the nation that cut funding to institutions as a society decided communities were better for people with IDD. Overall, it was a good thing, but the transition was hard. While the class members of Pennhurst received federally funded care on the account of the lawsuits against the school, other residents around the nation were not so lucky. For example, when the state-run Byberry in Philadelphia closed in 1990, the 600 residents that remained and could not be transferred or sent home were simply released onto the street with no support. Those sent home also might have been in support systems that were not counseled on best care. Elwyn tried stepping up to these challenges, providing larger services such as parent education programs, workshops, and early intervention programs to support people from entering institutions again. Overall, it was a good thing that put the community first, but Elwyn now is supporting people outside their walls in an attempt to be a community leader. Also, what was to be done with some of our residents at Elwyn? Elwyn was private, so we did not need to do state-mandated closings like state schools. But budget cuts to lifelong care were massive throughout the nation. Elwyn faced a tough choice for some residents who no longer had government financial support. Do they put them on the streets like other state-run institutions or continue care? In many cases, Elwyn chose to keep residents, understanding the ramifications for an individual who may have spent their whole lives at Elwyn, only to be told they must leave to be jobless and homeless. Some individuals took on small jobs on campus to help supplement their stay until death. Elwyn was not alone. Many other private institutions struggled to keep afloat as the national changes were made, and financial strain shuttered many of them. Elwyn is still adapting to societal changes and the needs of the community. The community still faces similar challenges to that in 1852. Job opportunities and transitional services are still needed. Elwyn has advanced these again by opening the Shrine Transition Center, which focuses on students from 18 to 21 who are preparing to graduate and live independently. Alongside math and reading, they learn to care for themselves by learning cooking, cleaning, and living in a studio apartment. A business center and cafe is run by students with oversight from their teachers. Students are responsible for customer service, opening and closing for the day, reordering and stocking. They are paid for their work at competitive wages. Other students leave the campus for the day, working at local supermarkets, pet adoption agencies, or restaurants. Not only are the students counseled, but the employers are to help both transition and adapt to the needs of the individual and provide better communication and treatment. Although still controversial to some within the advocacy community, Elwyn also provides more sheltered residential services on our campus, as we believe the choice is valuable to the individual and not all may want to be in community settings. I'll also touch very briefly on what we are doing in the archives. I may be biased, but our collection is a wonderful repository that reflects the history of disability. But as we've gone through this presentation, one thing may stand out. Where are the people we serve? They exist, but in the eyes of medical professionals, their caregivers, and the institution. With the opening of the archives as a public space, which happened 3 years ago, more effort has been put into not just allowing academic research, but to also record the voices of those we serve now to keep them for generations. Over here is an exhibit and presentation put together by the students in Shrine. They took a tour of the archive and we talked about the history of Elwyn, and this did include negative aspects like institutionalization. We contemplated how during the tour they did not hear the voices of the individuals like themselves and what it may be like to live 100 years ago. They then worked together with their teachers to provide a glimpse into what a modern voice is, and they wrote down their interests and their life stories, provided art projects and photo collages to deposit into the archives for future students to see. It's been a rewarding and powerful experience as students understand their place in history. As attitudes change, archives also must adapt to community approaches. Thank you so much for listening today. I do have some time for questions, but here's also my information if you would like to reach out for a tour or research in our collection and museum space that we have on our campus. Thank you.
Caitlin, thank you so much for this presentation. To the audience, if you would like to ask a question, either put it in the chat and I'll repeat it, or unmute and turn on your video and we can hear the question. It's interesting to me, a couple of things here, just listening to you. One is the point you made about urbanization and the fact that the family was a stronger unit in the rural setting, and they would care for those who could not care for themselves, whereas moving into a city, they became less able to do that and more dependent upon resources within the community. And that's an interesting perspective since we are so overwhelmingly urban today. I wonder also with regard to just your historical perspective, there are times when conditions will change their terminology. We may learn more about them, and as a result, the names change. And one thing today is what we see is a very high level of autism that's being identified in schools. And I wonder if, looking back, there's anything that would be autism, could have represented a similar thing, didn't have that name.
Yeah, when I know for me, and again, I'm not a historian, so I'm not as familiar with actual terminology and like how things were diagnosed. But I know I do when I look through our records, I do many times look through it and I am like, I don't think this person had IDD, just because of what their abilities were. You know, now we have a very standardized definition of what IDD is, and obviously there's still a spectrum on that. But we had students coming in that were, you know, able to read, write, you know, knew their whole alphabet, knew animals, knew all these things, and it's like, well, you know, what else was going on there? So I do sometimes wonder, you know, we probably were taking in students that may now have had, you know, what we would call autism or, you know, maybe even ADHD, that, you know, ended up being lumped in with IDD as well, just because we didn't fully understand the scientific understandings at the time.
Language is important, and you know the other thing that occurred to me listening to you is that today when we hear historical talks dealing with the disabled or dealing with the mentally ill or the like, and you see terms like feeble-minded or lunatic or things like that, they were technical terms in their day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Migrated into the slang, and then once they were adopted in the slang, they needed to revisit the term among those who actually suffered the condition and sort of retitle it. And so when we hear these terms today, we think that the people may have been very insensitive or the like. Quite the opposite, probably.
Yeah, I mean, again, none of these terms really existed. So when we look at so when we look at these terms, it is, you know, very shocking to see sometimes, and they do come, many of them, from kind of these derogatory roots when you look at the Greek words and their roots of them. But at the end of the day, they were trying to make some kind of connection and start to actually diagnose. And although we don't want to necessarily be making, you know, putting a whole diagnosis on someone as that's all they can be, you know, we do know, as I'm sure physicians, I'm not a physician, but as physicians, you know, that it is useful as a useful tool to have.
I think the other thing that comes out listening to you is a strength of the organization is the fact that it is a charitable organization. It has a loyal and energetic group of volunteers and people who want to donate, which provides resilience, and also in matters of dealing with the government provides a lobby that can stand for the organization and provide it with more security. You know, in strictly state-run institutions, too often they are subject to the fact that their status and the priorities may drop down quite a bit, and suddenly, like you mentioned, people are being released to the street in you know these unimaginable situations. We have a few comments here. Are you taking individuals who may not be able to benefit from schooling because they're so impaired?
Yeah, so we do have several different, and I don't know our services as in depth. I know the very treetop, so I do always want to make that clear because it's a large organization, and I'm the archivist. But I do know the treetops of what we do. So we do take in a wide array of individuals in both the Davidson School. So K through 12 is our Davidson School. And those students, it is a private school, and those students usually, I've always been told, it's kind of the last stop for many of these students. It's a lot of times students that maybe their parents did just want them to have, you know, a special smaller school, but there also are a lot of students in there that just were not thriving in public school in any way. So the public school system may pay for them to come to Elwyn. So, you know, that support will, you know, whatever district they're in, they will bus them to Elwyn to be educated. Since anyone, you know, K through 12 does deserve an education.
How many individuals are there now?
I'm sorry?
How big is Elwyn?
So I actually don't know how many residents we serve on the campus. I know we do have about 150 students at the Davidson School. I've asked before how many residents we have on our campus, and I've never gotten an answer. It's definitely less than it was in years past, a whole lot less, just from what I can see when I go around campus. But we do serve, I believe, about 1,000 or more people nationwide.
Mm-hmm. Another question: when did eugenics policies end at Elwyn?
Yeah. So, as from what I can see, they do end up ending more around 1960 when Clark does step in. I'm sure they still extend it some. He wasn't a perfect man, and I don't see any evidence of things like sterilizations happening, but I have, just heard from people that I've talked to from that era. They said that they were still happening. I have no actual evidence of whether they were or not. But we also were never performing a mass amount of sterilizations and things. And Clark obviously believed in placing people into communities. So they were starting that deinstitutionalization process, which would, kind of go against, the idea of eugenics, that people need to be segregated from society. So I would say around the 1960 mark is when we kind of start to phase out the eugenics.
It seems to me that to accept the concepts of eugenics and to compassionately treat these students who will be residents of Elwyn involves a certain cognitive dissonance there. There's a built-in conflict that must make it hard to work on both sides of that observation. Comment here: one of the most notorious institutions of this genre was Willowbrook in Staten Island, which closed in 1987 because of overcrowding, which then led to abuses of care. Could the success of Elwyn be attributed in part to its more controlled, limited enrollment and the like? Are they, yeah.
I do think they probably are connected. Aside from just like the evidence that we see that, again, despite many of these superintendents being eugenicists, they, what they're writing both supports eugenics, but also does show like this tenderness they have. We also were able to control who was coming into our building. And like, for example, in Barr's letters, we do see him turning people away because maybe they would need too much care. And he would state that Elwyn was not able to provide that amount of care, and he would usually recommend them to go to a state school. So a parent might write, or an aid society, and he would say, we can't care for this person. We don't take those types of cases, go to, usually it was local places. So Byberry, Penhurst, Norristown State Hospital, these more state-run schools. So we were able to control a lot of, the overcrowding that these state schools were getting because we didn't need to take these people. So I think that did also end up kind of benefiting the institution in the end, is that we were able to, unfortunately, and I guess fortunately at the same time, say no to people.
So I'm interested, I guess, in the notion that Elwyn actually has an archivist, that they're worried about their history and are actively doing that. Is a longstanding department, or how does it go?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit how that came to be. So from my understanding, it started around the 1980s with Marvin Kivitz, who I had mentioned. He was into research. He was a physician, so he is a lot more into, obviously, things that physicians do. But he also really was interested in history as well. And he believed that by learning our history, it could help the better care of individuals. So you see in the 1980s some glimpses of an archive starting. He starts to put some effort into starting to preserve the text that we already had, things of that nature. It never necessarily pops off anytime. And then later on, Dr. Elliot Simon, who our archive is named after him now, he was also, he was a psychologist and was also interested in history. And he spent a lot of time in the archive. He retired in 2015. And that was also when our current president, Chuck McLister, was starting. And to Elliot's credit, he was able to really bring home the importance of our collection. I have been told by people that our collection probably is one of the best in the nation because of how complete it is when it comes to care for IDD. And he really kind of brought that home to our president, Chuck, and kind of advocated that we start using it as an education resource and to allow academics in it, and also be able to have discussions around it. And 3 years ago, I was hired. So I was hired as their first archivist. They created a climate-controlled space, and now I am in a climate-controlled space. Not right now, but usually I'm in a climate-controlled space with the collection, and we do allow academic researchers. We also allow students and residents and community members into the space. And we also do different tours and things like that. And hopefully we're going through more campus changes. We're hoping to maybe even grow that more and have a more dedicated, bigger space for it, where we could hold like seminars and things like that on the history of not just Elwyn, but how, care has evolved by using our collections.
That's wonderful. I think that valuing the history of an organization says a lot about how much they care about what they're doing now. That's really important. There's another one here. How did the history of children at Elwyn doing work or making things align with issues? I guess the issue about when does training end and child labor begin? For the physicians on this, we all face that with our residency as well. So this is a problem that is in more places than one, but could you address that question?
Yeah, that actually is a good question. And I don't know the complete answer for you, but one I can say is obviously we weren't necessarily, I guess when child labor laws did start to come into play, we weren't necessarily affected because we were still having children do labor. So I think a lot of it was that it was under the guise of teaching. They were doing vocational trade. They were being taught something so they could produce work. Therefore, they weren't necessarily working. And that does then end up changing in 1977. As I mentioned, there is a student, I believe, that ends up suing Pennhurst. And that starts to make larger sweeping changes within the school systems to kind of differentiate what is, also child labor within a school system as well. Because though Pennhurst was state run, it was a school. So they were also having students do similar type work. And so we start to kind of, shift from there. But that is a good question that I should probably look a little more into.
Okay, well, with that, I will thank you for giving us this presentation. I think it was wonderful. It was an important topic. Again, thank you so much, Caitlin, for helping us today. This was very important and very good. And a good night to everyone.
Yes, thank you so much for listening and having me. It was a good time.